It was a sweltering summer afternoon in a quaint town nestled between rolling hills and dense woodlands. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets, where locals went about their day with the languid pace of people accustomed to heat. The hum of cicadas filled the air, broken only by the occasional laughter of children playing or the distant bark of a dog. Dr. Michael Warren, a veterinarian known throughout town for his compassion and tireless dedication to animals, was closing his clinic for the day. He had just finished his last appointment and was wiping his brow when his phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the calm of the early evening. On the other end was an agitated voice, a local farmer, breathless with urgency. "Doc, you gotta come quick," the man panted. "There's a dog tied up out by the old oak on Red River Road. Looks like he's been there a while." Michael's heart sank. He had heard similar calls before, too many times. Abandoned dogs, mistreated animals. This wasn't uncommon in small rural towns, but it never got any easier to deal with. Grabbing his keys and rushing out the door, Michael felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. The drive to Red River Road took only a few minutes, but the knot in his stomach tightened with every passing second. When he arrived, the scene was worse than he had imagined. Tethered to a tree, barely visible under the thick canopy of leaves, was a large German shepherd. Its once proud stance had been reduced to a frail slouch. The dog was filthy, its fur matted with dirt and blood, and its ribs visible beneath its ragged coat. Its eyes, dark and hollow, blinked slowly as it stared at Michael, too weak even to react. Without hesitation, Michael jumped from his truck and approached cautiously, his movements slow and deliberate. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and neglect. The dog's collar was digging into its neck, a thin chain that had been wrapped too tightly around the tree trunk. As Michael knelt beside him, he whispered softly, his voice a soothing balm amidst the harsh surroundings. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay. I'm here now." The German shepherd, who Michael decided to call Shadow for the time being, was severely dehydrated, and from the looks of his injuries, it was clear he had been left alone for days, possibly longer. Michael carefully removed the chain and scooped the dog into his arms, feeling the frailty of Shadow's body. His fingers grazed over open wounds and sores as the dog whimpered softly, his breathing shallow but steady. Michael rushed back to his clinic, his heart pounding with urgency. He couldn't shake the image of Shadow, tied and forgotten, left to suffer in silence. It enraged him, but more than that, it stirred a deep sadness. As a vet, Michael had seen his share of neglect, but something about this dog, the quiet dignity in his suffering, tugged at him in a way he hadn't felt in years. In the clinic, under the bright lights and sterile smells, Michael went to work. The clinic was small but well-equipped, its walls lined with certificates, and the familiar hum of medical equipment providing a background to the task at hand. Shadow didn't resist as he cleaned the wounds and administered fluids, his hands moving deftly from years of practice. Michael noticed several deep gashes on Shadow's legs and sides, some infected, others crusted over with dried blood. He worked meticulously, disinfecting the injuries, applying ointment, and wrapping the dog in clean bandages. Shadow remained still, his eyes following Michael's every move, not with fear, but with a weariness that spoke of a life spent in hardship. As Michael worked, his thoughts began to race. Who could have done this? And why? For hours, Michael tended to Shadow, until at last, the dog seemed to rest more easily, his breathing deepening as exhaustion overcame him. Michael sat back, wiping the sweat from his brow, feeling a mix of relief and anger. He knew he couldn't leave it at this. Whoever had done this needed to answer for it, and Shadow needed justice. Just as he was finishing up, the bell above the clinic door chimed. Michael looked up, and standing in the doorway was a tall, broad-shouldered man. His face was twisted in a scowl, his eyes darting to the dog on the table. "That's my dog," the man snarled. "Where the hell do you get off talking him without permission?" Michael's heart skipped a beat as he stood, placing himself between the man and Shadow. The tension in the air thickened, the kind that spoke of more than just a misunderstanding. There was something menacing in the man's stance, in the way his fists clenched at his sides. "You left him out there to die," Michael said, his voice steady but laced with fury. The man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know nothing about it." Michael's pulse quickened. This was the moment everything would change, and he had no idea what the next few seconds would bring. The air in the clinic seemed to grow heavier as the man stepped closer, his presence looming over Michael. His fists clenched and unclenched, his face darkening with a mix of anger and frustration. Michael stood his ground, his heart racing, but his resolve firm. He couldn't let Shadow go back to whatever nightmare this man had put him through. "Look," Michael began, trying to keep his voice calm but authoritative, "this dog is in terrible shape. He needs proper medical attention, and it's clear he hasn't been getting that with you. I'm not letting him go." The man's expression hardened. "I don't care what you think. Shadow's mine, and I'll take him whether you like it or not." Michael noticed the man's hands twitch toward his belt, where a large set of keys dangled. He quickly realized this wasn't just about retrieving a dog. This was about control. Shadow wasn't just an animal to this man. He was property. And the way the man spoke about him sent a chill down Michael's spine. "Shadow needs help," Michael insisted, keeping his voice steady, though the tension was palpable. "He's injured, dehydrated, and malnourished. If you cared about him at all, you'd leave him here and let me treat him." The man sneered, stepping even closer, his towering frame now uncomfortably near. "You're gonna regret meddling in my business, Doc," he growled. "I'll be back with the cops, and you'll have no choice but to hand him over." Michael felt the weight of the man's threat settle in the pit of his stomach, but he refused to back down. "Do what you have to do," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "But this dog isn't going anywhere tonight." With a sharp glare, the man turned on his heel and stormed out of the clinic, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the small space, leaving Michael in the sudden silence, the weight of the confrontation pressing on him. He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair, trying to collect his thoughts. Shadow lay on the exam table, watching the door as it closed. For a moment, the dog's body tensed, as though expecting his owner to return and deliver another round of punishment. His eyes, a deep, soulful brown, reflected a mixture of fear and confusion. Despite everything, there was still a trace of loyalty in the way Shadow looked toward the door, as if some part of him believed he belonged to that man. Michael's heart ached for the dog. He had seen this before, animals who, despite suffering abuse, remained loyal to their owners out of instinct, out of a bond that should have been one of care but had been twisted into something cruel. Michael leaned down, gently scratching behind Shadow's ears, his touch soft and comforting. "You're safe now, boy. No one's gonna hurt you again." Later that evening, after ensuring Shadow was resting as comfortably as possible, Michael heard a knock at the clinic's back door. It was unusual for anyone to come that way, especially after hours. He opened it cautiously, finding Mrs. Talbot, a woman who lived just a few doors down from Derek, the man who had claimed to own Shadow. She was clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders, her eyes wide with concern. "I saw Derek leaving here earlier," she said in a hushed tone, glancing over her shoulder nervously. "I need to talk to you, Dr. Warren. It's about that dog." Michael stepped aside, letting her in. Her face was lined with worry as she looked around the clinic, her gaze settling on Shadow, who was still lying on the table, his breathing slow and labored. Shadow, while stable, was clearly still in a fragile state. His breathing, though steady, was shallow, and his movements were stiff. Michael could tell that the recovery would be long and arduous. The injury Shadow had endured, along with his weakened physical condition, would require weeks of care before he could regain his strength. "That poor creature," Mrs. Talbot whispered, shaking her head. "I've seen him tied up behind Derek's house more times than I can count. He doesn't treat him right. He uses the dog to punish him, to scare folks. But yesterday, it was worse than usual. I saw him drag that dog out to the old oak and leave him there, chained up like he wasn't planning to come back for him. Michael felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked, though he kept his voice soft. Mrs. Talbot wrung her hands nervously. "Derek's a dangerous man. People around here are scared of him, Doctor. He's got a temper, and nobody wants to be the one who crosses him." Michael sighed. It all made sense now. The cruelty, the neglect, and why Shadow had been left to die in that isolated spot. Derek had been using the dog as a tool, a pawn in some twisted game of control and intimidation. Mrs. Talbot's voice trembled as she continued, "You have to be careful. Derek's known for holding grudges. Last year, he got into a fight with a neighbor over some land dispute, and, well, the man's truck didn't make it through the night. Set on fire, they say." Michael clenched his fists, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "Thank you for telling me," he said, his mind racing. "I'll make sure Shadow's safe. But you should stay away from Derek, too. He won't take this lightly." Mrs. Talbot nodded, her face pale. "Just be careful, Doctor. He's not the kind of man to let things go." With that, she slipped back into the night, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts and the quiet hum of the clinic. He stood by Shadow's side, his hand resting on the dog's back, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. Shadow was a survivor, that much was clear. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Derek would be back, and when he did, things could get much worse. The clinic was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers or the hum of machinery, but Michael's mind was far from at peace. He knew Derek's type, someone who thrived on fear and intimidation. And now, Michael had placed himself directly in Derek's path. As the hours wore on, Michael's exhaustion finally caught up with him. He found himself dozing off in his chair next to Shadow, his thoughts still tangled in worry. Just as he began to drift into a restless sleep, Shadow stirred, his head lifting slightly. The dog's ears perked up, and he let out a low, soft whine, his eyes fixed on the clinic door as if he sensed something outside. Michael's heart raced as he stood, moving toward the door, wondering if Derek had returned, ready to make good on his threats. Michael's pulse quickened as he moved toward the door, every nerve on edge. Shadow's low whine followed him, the dog clearly sensing something. Michael paused for a moment, straining to listen, but the clinic was silent, too silent. He unlocked the door cautiously and opened it just a crack, peering out into the dimly lit alley behind the clinic. Nothing. A cold breeze drifted in, unsettling him further. He scanned the shadows, looking for any movement, any sign that Derek had returned. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Derek was out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for his chance? But after several tense moments, Michael sighed and shut the door, making sure it was locked securely this time. Shadow, now sitting upright, was still watching the door intently, his dark eyes flickering with both fear and confusion. Michael knelt beside him, rubbing his fur gently, trying to calm the dog's trembling body. "It's okay, boy," Michael whispered. "He's not here. You're safe." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. Was Shadow truly safe? Derek wasn't the kind of man to back down easily, and Michael had no illusions about the danger that now surrounded him and the clinic. The next few days were filled with unease. Michael went about his work as usual, but there was a constant sense of being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that Derek, or someone working with him, was keeping tabs on him. His neighbors had mentioned seeing a beat-up old truck slowly circling the clinic late at night. Tools went missing from the shed behind his clinic, and on 2 occasions, Michael found strange footprints in the dirt just outside the clinic's back door. Though nothing was ever overtly damaged, the subtle signs were there. Derek was making his presence felt. Shadow, meanwhile, had grown slightly stronger under Michael's care. His wounds were healing, though slowly, and his appetite had returned. The dog still carried the weight of his trauma, flinching at loud noises and remaining wary of strangers, but his bond with Michael was growing. Whenever Michael entered the room, Shadow's tail would wag faintly, and he would lift his head, showing trust that was slowly replacing the fear in his eyes. But Michael's relief at Shadow's improvement was overshadowed by the mounting tension around him. Each day, he found himself looking over his shoulder, expecting Derek to make good on his threats. The authorities had been no help. Without concrete evidence of harm, they said there was little they could do. They had promised to keep an eye on Derek, but Michael knew it wouldn't be enough. Derek was dangerous, and he was patient. In his moments of doubt, Michael briefly considered contacting a local animal welfare organization, one that specialized in rescuing and rehoming animals from abusive situations. The thought provided him a small sense of comfort, knowing there were groups out there like SPCA that could help animals like Shadow. But he quickly dismissed the idea. It wasn't fast enough. He knew Derek's next move would come sooner rather than later, and waiting on outside help might be too late. The turning point came one cold evening, just after sunset. Michael returned home after a long day at the clinic, only to find his front door slightly ajar. His heart dropped as he pushed the door open slowly, a creeping sense of dread settling over him. The house was in disarray, furniture overturned, papers strewn across the floor. Someone had been here, and they hadn't been careful about hiding it. Shadow. Michael called out, panic rising in his chest as he searched the house for the dog. But Shadow was gone. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Derek had taken him. Michael's mind raced, his hands shaking as he looked around, desperate for any clue about where they might have gone. The phone in his pocket buzzed, pulling him from his frantic search. He answered it without thinking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. A low, gravelly voice greeted him on the other end. "You're looking for your dog, aren't you?" Michael's blood ran cold. It was Derek. "I told you to stay out of my business, Doc," Derek continued, his voice thick with satisfaction. "But you didn't listen. Now you're going to learn the hard way. What have you done with him?" Michael demanded, his voice trembling with both fear and fury. Derek chuckled darkly. "He's where he belongs. But if you want him back, you'd better come find me. You know where I am." The line went dead. Michael stood frozen, his mind reeling. He knew where Derek was. There was only one place he would go. The old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a place Derek had been known to use as a hideout in the past. A place he could do what he wanted without prying eyes. There was no time to waste. Michael grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his mind singularly focused on one thing: getting Shadow back. The drive to the warehouse was a blur, the darkened roads and flickering streetlights passing by in a haze. His heart pounded in his chest, fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. When he arrived, the warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted doors barely hanging on their hinges. The place looked abandoned, but Michael knew better. He parked a distance away, not wanting to draw attention, and quietly made his way toward the building. The closer he got, the more his fear intensified. What if Shadow was too hurt? What if Derek had already done something terrible to him? Michael pushed the thoughts aside, forcing himself to focus. He had to be careful. If Derek sensed him coming, it could make things worse for both him and Shadow. As Michael approached the entrance, he saw the faint glow of a light inside. His footsteps were soft as he crept closer, his heart hammering in his ears. He peered through a crack in the door, and there, in the dim light, he saw Shadow. The dog was tied up again, this time with a thick rope, his body limp and weak. His fur was matted with fresh blood, and his eyes, though barely open, caught sight of Michael with a faint flicker of recognition. But before Michael could take another step, a voice rang out from the shadows. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Derek stepped out of the darkness, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He held a knife in his hand, its blade glinting menacingly in the light. Michael's breath caught in his throat as Derek moved toward Shadow, his intentions clear. "You should have stayed out of this, Doc," Derek snarled. "Now you're going to watch me finish what I started." Michael's heart raced as Derek moved toward Shadow, his grip tightening around the knife. The sight of the gleaming blade near the weakened dog sent a surge of panic through him. He couldn't let Derek do this. Shadow had already suffered too much, Every muscle in his body tensed, his mind scrambling for a way to stop what was about to happen. "Derek, don't!" Michael shouted, stepping forward, his hands raised. "You don't have to do this." Derek stopped for a moment, his cruel smile widening. He tilted his head, as though savoring the power he held over both Michael and the dog. "This is all your fault, Doc," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You should have stayed out of it. But now you get to watch." Michael's mind flashed back to a time long ago, when he and Derek had once crossed paths in a way that had seemed insignificant to him at the time. It had been a minor incident, a disagreement about land boundaries when Michael first moved to the town. Michael had forgotten all about it, but now, staring at Derek's twisted expression, he realized that this was the source of Derek's rage. Derek had nursed this grudge for years, and now he was using Shadow to exact his revenge. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears as Derek crouched down near Shadow, the blade dangerously close to the dog's side. Michael couldn't let it happen. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his body acting on pure instinct. He grabbed at Derek's arm, desperately trying to wrestle the knife away from him. A chaotic struggle ensued. Derek was strong, his anger giving him an edge, but Michael fought with everything he had. They tumbled to the ground, the sound of their scuffle echoing through the empty warehouse. Michael's thoughts raced. He had stopped Derek. He had to protect Shadow. The two men struggled, their grunts of effort filling the air as the knife flashed between them. In the midst of the fight, Michael caught a glimpse of Shadow, lying motionless, but with his eyes fixed on the two men. There was a flicker of recognition, a silent plea in the dog's gaze, as though Shadow understood that Michael was fighting for him. That single moment gave Michael the strength to push harder. Finally, with a surge of adrenaline, Michael managed to knock the knife from Derek's hand. It clattered to the ground, skidding across the concrete floor. Derek growled in frustration, his face contorted in rage. But before he could make another move, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Both men froze. The piercing wail of approaching police cars grew louder, and Derek's eyes darted toward the warehouse door. Panic flashed across his face for the first time. The authorities were here. A moment later, the warehouse door burst open, and several police officers stormed in, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. Derek cursed under his breath as he scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The officers quickly surrounded him, guns drawn, and he had no choice but to raise his hands in surrender. Michael stood shakily, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart was still racing, but relief washed over him as the officers subdued Derek, handcuffing him and leading him away. The nightmare was finally over. As the adrenaline ebbed, Michael turned his attention to Shadow. The dog was still lying on the ground, but his eyes followed Michael's movements with a faint glimmer of hope. Michael rushed to his side, kneeling down and gently running his hands over Shadow's body, checking for any new injuries. "He's going to be okay," one of the officers said, walking over to Michael. "We got a tip that something was going down here. Someone called it in anonymously." Michael nodded, though his focus was entirely on Shadow. The officer's words registered only faintly in his mind. Someone had called it in. But who? He hadn't had time to reach out to anyone, and Derek certainly wouldn't have done it. His thoughts briefly turned to Mrs. Talbot, and a wave of gratitude washed over him. It had to have been her. She couldn't stand by and watch Derek's cruelty any longer. Shadow let out a soft whine as Michael stroked his head, his body trembling but alive. Michael's chest tightened as he looked into the dog's eyes, seeing the pain and fear that still lingered there, but also a new flicker of trust. Shadow was safe now. He would never have to endure Derek's abuse again. With the police escorting Derek out of the warehouse and securing the scene, Michael gently lifted Shadow into his arms. The dog was light, far too light for his size, and the effort took more out of Michael than he expected. But Shadow didn't protest. He rested his head against Michael's chest, his body finally relaxing as though he knew he was truly safe for the first time in a long while. Michael drove back to the clinic in silence, his mind replaying the events of the night. He couldn't shake the feeling of relief, but there was also a deep sadness that lingered. The cruelty that Shadow had endured was unimaginable, and while Michael had saved him, he couldn't erase the scars of the past. Over the next several weeks, Shadow's recovery became Michael's sole focus. The dog, though physically fragile, began to heal. His wounds closed, his strength returned, and with time, the fear in his eyes began to fade. Michael made sure that Shadow's future would be different. A loving family, one that Michael trusted deeply, came forward to adopt him. They had experience with rescue dogs and were ready to give Shadow the second chance he deserved. On the day Shadow went to his new home, Michael stood outside the clinic, watching as the family led the dog to their car. Shadow turned his head back one last time, his eyes meeting Michael's with a quiet understanding. There was no need for words. Michael knew that Shadow was finally at peace. As the car pulled away, Michael couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. Shadow had been a victim of cruelty, but he had survived. And in that survival, he had found something most animals long for: love, care, and a home where he would never be hurt again. Michael smiled to himself as he locked up the clinic for the night. He didn't consider himself a hero, but tonight, as he walked into the quiet of his home, he realized that sometimes heroes don't wear capes. They wear stethoscopes and spend their days saving the lives of creatures who can't speak for themselves.